Pronation, pronation, pronation. It seems like the only thing you hear about these days in regards to arm wrestling training is pronation. Over the last year, nearly every fan of the sport has attempted the notorious Devon Larratt pronation lift at one point or another. This lift became so famous it was hard to avoid seeing it even if you wanted to, which to be fair was partly my fault. But in this video, we're going to do something that is far from arm wrestling orthodoxy. We're not just going to question whether or not Devon's lift was a good idea. We're going to go deeper than that. We're going to question whether pronation even matters at all. Let's begin. Firstly, we need to define pronation. In this video, we will be talking specifically about pronation through the wrist. It is possible to generate pronation pressure in a match from your shoulder or even by rotating your entire body. But we will be defining pronation as going from a position where the inside of your wrist is facing up to where the inside of your wrist is facing down. Accordingly, isometric pronation will be defined as preventing the reversal of this process from taking place. Now that we have a working definition of what pronation is, let's talk about what pronation is used for. Traditionally, the most common use of pronation is to fight against your opponent's cupping. In arm wrestling, you have many opposing forces: opposing back pressure, opposing side pressure, opposing rising, etc. But in the case of pronation and cupping, you are fighting your opponent's pronation with your cupping, while at the same time fighting their cupping with your pronation. And of course, your opponent is doing the exact same thing. Pronation and cupping define the battle of the hand and wrist. If your opponent is able to pronate, it means you need stronger cupping. And if you're getting cupped by your opponent, it means you need stronger pronation. Or does it? Oftentimes, we think of pronation as the exact opposite or opposing force to cupping. But I think that in reality, pronation is hardly even relevant when compared to your opponent's cupping. There is no way that the tiny little muscle used for turning the doorknob will be anywhere near the strength of your cupping. So it's hopeless, right? How could anyone ever defeat their opponent's cupping? Well, if you're trying to defeat your opponent's cupping with isolated pronation, this is a near impossible task no matter how strong you are. Fortunately, our pronator is not alone in this task. Pronation is always accompanied by back pressure. Your back pressure and pronation work together to attack your opponent's cupping. But what I am proposing in this video is that the combination of back pressure and pronation is nowhere near a 50-50 split on workload. It's probably closer to 90% back pressure and 10% pronation. And it might be even higher than that. In other words, if you were getting cupped in by your opponent, making your pronation stronger will hardly do anything, but making your back pressure stronger will make a huge difference. Let's take a listen to the arm wrestling legend and coach Bob Brown explaining the relationship between back pressure, pronation, and cupping.
In order to open up someone's wrist, or at least to maintain it being flat, most of that is back pressure. God rest his soul, Jason Vale is probably the biggest example of this. He was opening up people's hands and wrists, and he didn't really have a very strong pronator or strong fingers or strong cup or strong knuckles up. His back pressure made up for all of it.
So, if someone is going to cup you in, they absolutely have to open your elbow flexor angle provided your setup is perfect. And this leads us into a very important part of this concept, and that is your setup. If your setup is perfect, your opponent will be forced to fight your elbow flexor at its full potential. But if your setup is not perfect, they will not need to do this. For example, if you allow your opponent to set up toward the back of the pad and slide their elbow forward upon the go, they will be able to cup you in without having to fight your elbow flexor, just like what Devon Larratt did against Travis Bagent at Arm Wars. If you want to force your opponent to fight the full force of your back pressure, as Devon Larratt would say, you must always stay just out of reach. So the level of importance ratio I gave earlier of 90% back pressure versus 10% pronation is only applicable if your setup is perfect. Speaking of people who have a perfect setup, let's hear from the GOAT of arm wrestling, Mindaugas Tarasidis, on this same topic.
Everyone in arm wrestling communities keeps mentioning pronation, and I'm somehow not really convinced if it's really that important.
The pronation muscle pronator is not a big muscle, so it's not really effective.
I think what's much more effective is the back pressure and the ability to go back.
I think the opinion we hear from Indaugas on this subject is very important because of his position in the sport. He is the guy that is known for being weaker than his opponent, yet still managing to crack people's wrists back. He was able to defeat Daniil Prokopchuk by cracking his wrist back over rounds. He didn't do this by having the world's strongest pronation, but rather he did this by having a perfect setup and perfect mid-match technique that gave him access to the entirety of his back pressure and side pressure. Another great example of the level of importance ratio between back pressure and pronation is Hermes Gasparini. Hermes is known for having some of the strongest back pressure in the world. However, we've also seen Hermes try the Devon Larratt pronation lift, and he is nowhere near as strong as Devon in pronation. But look at what happens when we compare Hermes versus Evgeny Prudnik and Devon versus Evgeny Prudnik. Prudnik just might be the best hook puller in the world, and we saw that Devon struggled a lot while trying to prevent Prudnik from cupping his wrist. He was nearly pinned in the first round and was forced into a full king's move inside of straps. However, when we saw Hermes pulling Prudnik, Hermes is totally toying with him. Prudnik looks like he's redlining and Hermes is laughing. Prudnik has absolutely no chance of cupping his wrist against Hermes. So what's the difference between Devon and Hermes? It's their back pressure. Devon's elbow flexor is getting totally stretched out, whereas Hermes' elbow flexion is not getting stretched out. We literally see Hermes hooking Prudnik and then rolling right back out at will with seemingly no efforts. Remember, Hermes has measurably less pronation than Devon, but he has measurably more back pressure than Devon. And this result is reflected in their training. Hermes has a much higher emphasis on isolated back pressure, whereas Devon has a much higher emphasis on back pressure through pronation. So, what is the point of all of this? Should you just stop training pronation altogether? No, that's not what I am proposing. What I am proposing is having a more realistic approach to training. If you are getting cupped in by your opponent, you probably don't need more pronation. You probably need more back pressure, or you need to improve your setup. In other words, back pressure is the cake and pronation is the icing. I've shown these clips of seasoned arm wrestlers having similar positions to demonstrate that I am not trying to invent some new training philosophy. There are a ton of very experienced arm wrestlers that already value back pressure way more than pronation for the purpose of fighting cup. There is also nothing wrong with the Devon Larratt pronation lift or any other pronation lift. I am simply saying that pronation lifts should not be the emphasis of your training, but rather they should be accessories. And if you would like a super practical method of experiencing exactly how steep the ratio is, next time you're at arm wrestling practice, try to top roll your opponent while incorporating zero back pressure. You can only use isolated pronation. After this, do the exact opposite. Put out a dead fish for a hand and try to top roll your opponent with only back pressure. You might be surprised with how effective your top roll still is even without pronation. Sometimes you can even crack your opponent's wrist back while supinating. You might also be surprised to find out that you can't even top roll your grandma without using back pressure. Hopefully all of this rambling makes sense and promotes a deeper dive into arm wrestling philosophy. And for now, happy back pressure training.